Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a sticky golden summer somewhere in the countryside of northern Japan, back when dragonflies hovered like tiny helicopters and the air buzzed with cicadas from morning to night. The days were long, and the sky always looked like it had been washed in pale blue watercolor. You might not have experienced this before, but there's a kind of sleepy rhythm to rural summers, where every day feels like a slightly rearranged version of the last. And when you're a kid, that stretch of time can feel like forever. You're tucked in now, I hope blanket light on your chest, maybe a bit of fan breeze brushing your cheeks, eyelids getting heavier by the minute. If so, perfect. Because tonight's story is about one of those summers when my brother and I set out to build something big, or at least bigger than we were. It didn't go quite as planned. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these sleepy little stories. It really helps the channel, and I love having you here. All right, now let's get into today's diary entry. I must have been about 10 that year, and my brother Kenji was 12. He was just old enough to think he knew everything, and I was just young enough to believe him. We were staying with our grandmother while our parents traveled for work, which meant we had the run of the place, at least during the hours she wasn't keeping an eye on us, from the kitchen window with a wooden spoon in hand. Our grandmother's farm sat on the edge of a sleepy village. It had wide open fields that glowed gold in the sun, a narrow stream where dragonflies liked to dip their tails, and a small vegetable patch that we were strictly forbidden from touching, though we often did. There was also an old barn with a sagging roof, a creaky windmill that barely turned, and a row of persimmon trees that gave off the sourest fruit in existence. And behind the barn, just past a row of overgrown hydrangeas and some very angry wasps, was a tree. Not just any tree. The tree. A Japanese Zelkova, I think, but it might as well have been a skyscraper to us. The trunk was thick enough that both Kenji and I could barely wrap our arms around it, and the branches twisted upward like an open hand. It had that perfect kind of fork in the middle, about 10 feet up wide and flat, and shaded like it had been waiting for someone to build something in it. I don't remember who saw it first, but I remember the feeling. That weird, exciting little tickle in your ribs when your brain decides it's just come up with the best idea ever. "We should build a treehouse," I whispered. Kenji squinted up at the branches. "In that," I nodded, "it's perfect." He scratched his chin like someone about to make a complicated trade deal. "Do you even know how to build one?" "Nope," I said. "Do we have nails?" I paused. "Nope." "Wood refrigerator made sucks. Maybe." He snorted, then turned away, already bored. But I wasn't done yet. "We don't need nails," I said quickly. "I read about it once. There was a tribe that made houses out of rope and wood and stuff. Just tied everything together." Kenji turned back. "Like, no nails at all?" "None," I said, puffing my chest out a bit. "Totally natural, traditional, eco-friendly." He stared at me, and I could see the gears turning. There was something about the idea of doing it without nails that appealed to him, not because it was smarter, but because it sounded harder. And Kenji loved doing things the hard way, if only to prove he could. "All right," he said at last. "We'll do it. No nails. But if it falls, it's your fault. Deal." We shook hands like gentlemen in a spy movie and immediately got to work. That meant we ran back to the barn and dug through every pile of forgotten junk we could find. Old fence posts, a pile of bamboo poles, a busted bicycle rim, and about 200 feet of itchy old rope that smelled like mildew and sadness. We stacked our treasures next to the tree and admired the pile with great pride. I imagined how the treehouse would look a full second story up in the branches, maybe with a secret trapdoor and a flag on top. Kenji was already muttering something about making it 2 rooms, one for each of us. It was already late afternoon, the sun low and golden. The field shimmered with heat, and the cicadas droned like they were singing back up to our ambition. We didn't build anything that day. We just gathered materials, made sketches in the dirt with sticks, and argued over what color the flag should be. But in our heads it had already begun. We had a tree, we had rope, and we had an idea. And sometimes that's all a summer needs to become unforgettable. Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a sticky golden summer somewhere in the countryside of northern Japan, back when dragonflies hovered like tiny helicopters and the air buzzed with cicadas from morning to night. The days were long, and the sky always looked like it had been washed in pale blue watercolor. You might not have experienced this before, but there's a kind of sleepy rhythm to rural summers, where every day feels like a slightly rearranged version of the last. And when you're a kid, that stretch of time can feel like forever. You're tucked in now, I hope blanket light on your chest, maybe a bit of fan breeze brushing your cheeks, eyelids getting heavier by the minute. If so, perfect. Because tonight's story is about one of those summers when my brother and I set out to build something big. Or at least bigger than we were. It didn't go quite as planned. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these sleepy little stories. It really helps the channel, and I love having you here. All right, now let's get into today's diary entry. I must have been about 10 that year, and my brother Kenji was 12. He was just old enough to think he knew everything, and I was just young enough to believe him. We were staying with our grandmother while our parents traveled for work, which meant we had the run of the place at least during the hours she wasn't keeping an eye on us from the kitchen window with a wooden spoon in hand. Our grandmother's farm sat on the edge of a sleepy village. It had wide open fields that glowed gold in the sun, a narrow stream where dragonflies liked to dip their tails, and a small vegetable patch that we were strictly forbidden from touching, though we often did. There was also an old barn with a sagging roof, a creaky windmill that barely turned, and a row of persimmon trees that gave off the sourest fruit in existence. And behind the barn, just past a row of overgrown hydrangeas and some very angry wasps, was a tree. Not just any tree, the tree. A Japanese zelkova, I think, but it might as well have been a skyscraper to us. The trunk was thick enough that both Kenji and I could barely wrap our arms around it, and the branches twisted upward like an open hand. It had that perfect kind of fork in the middle, about 10 feet up wide and flat, and shaded like it had been waiting for someone to build something in it. I don't remember who saw it first, but I remember the feeling. That weird, exciting little tickle in your ribs when your brain decides it's just come up with the best idea ever. "We should build a treehouse," I whispered. Kenji squinted up at the branches. "In that?" I nodded. "It's perfect." He scratched his chin like someone about to make a complicated trade deal. "Do you even know how to build one?" "Nope," I said. "Do we have nails?" I paused. "Nope." "Maybe you went for Mirer, maybe." He snorted, then turned away, already bored. But I wasn't done yet. "We don't need nails," I said quickly. "I read about it once. There was a tribe that made houses out of rope and wood and stuff. Just tied everything together." Kenji turned back. "Like, no nails at all?" "None," I said, puffing my chest out a bit. "Totally natural, traditional, eco-friendly." He stared at me, and I could see the gears turning. There was something about the idea of doing it without nails that appealed to him, not because it was smarter, but because it sounded harder. And Kenji loved doing things the hard way, if only to prove he could. "All right," he said at last. "We'll do it. No nails, but if it falls, it's your fault. Deal." We shook hands like gentlemen in a spy movie and immediately got to work. That meant we ran back to the barn and dug through every pile of forgotten junk we could find. Old fence posts, a pile of bamboo poles, a busted bicycle rim, and about 200 feet of itchy old rope that smelled like mildew and sadness. We stacked our treasures next to the tree and admired the pile with great pride. I imagined how the treehouse would look a full second story up in the branches, maybe with a secret trapdoor and a flag on top. Kenji was already muttering something about making it 2 rooms, one for each of us. It was already late afternoon, the sun low and golden. The fields shimmered with heat and the cicadas droned like they were singing back up to our ambition. We didn't build anything that day. We just gathered materials, made sketches in the dirt with sticks, and argued over what color the flag should be. But in our heads, it had already begun. We had a tree, we had rope, and we had an idea. And sometimes that's all a summer needs to become unforgettable. The next day we woke up sore, mosquito-bitten, and more determined than ever. Kenji announced over breakfast that today's approach would be engineering-based. He said it like he'd studied at some elite construction academy, even though the closest he'd been to engineering was building bridges out of chopsticks and chewing gum wrappers. Grandma didn't say a word. She simply stirred her soup, cracked an egg with one hand, and slid a sideways glance our way. Outside, the sky was hazy with heat. The kind of day where your feet stuck to the floorboards and the only breeze came from waving your hand in front of your face. We dragged ourselves out to the tree again, wood in one hand, the cursed rope in the other. Kenji set up our blueprint, a dirt drawing so vague it looked like a spider had danced across the ground with muddy feet. Still, we had a plan. Instead of laying all the planks flat across 2 branches, we'd start with a frame, a square, a base, something sturdy, something that wouldn't immediately fall apart. "We'll build the base first," Kenji said, squinting at the tree. "Then tie the planks to that." "You mean like a box?" "Exactly, a floating box." I gave him a thumbs up, like I totally understood what that meant. To avoid climbing unnecessarily, we decided to build the base on the ground first, then somehow hoist it up and wedge it between the branches. It was only once we finished building it, 4 uneven wooden beams lashed tightly together with 3 different colors of rope, that we realized it was way too big to lift. We tried anyway. Kenji counted to 3, and we both squatted down and heaved upward. It lifted about half an inch before crashing back down and rolling into a patch of thistle. We stared at it. Kenji wiped his forehead. Maybe we should have built it in the tree. I sat down beside the floating box, breathing hard. Or maybe we need a crane. We were about 5 minutes into a full-on sulk when I had an idea. A terrible idea. One of those ideas that sound amazing when you're a kid and absolutely ridiculous in hindsight. What if I said slowly, we build it in pieces up there and tie it together once it's already in place? Kenji blinked. Like assemble the box in the tree. Yeah, smaller parts easier to carry. He considered it for a long moment. That's actually smart. My chest puffed out with pride. Thanks. Still your fault if it falls. Fair. So we climbed again. The same rough branches, the same shaky fork, the same feeling that the ground was getting farther and farther away, even though we weren't that high. We took 2 beams up first and tied them across the fork, this time tighter, slower. No double, triple snake loops. We invented a new one called the tiger twist, which involved looping the rope around and around until we got dizzy and then tying it off with a bow. It took over an hour, but we had 2 sides of the square frame in place. Then we climbed down, grabbed the remaining pieces, and hauled them up like we were on a mission. Sweat poured down our necks, but we didn't care. And then it happened. Kenji was leaning out just slightly, trying to tie the final corner. I was holding the rope steady, looping it around like he'd shown me. But something shifted. Maybe the rope twisted wrong. Maybe the board wasn't balanced right. Either way, I heard a sharp snap followed by Kenji yelling, "Whoa!" Then silence. Then a loud thump. I scrambled down the tree so fast I practically dropped from branch to branch. When I got to the bottom, I saw him sitting in the middle of the feed pile behind the barn. It must have broken his fall, softened by straw and half-eaten grain. He looked up at me with a dazed expression. Feathers were stuck in his hair. "You okay?" I asked, panting. He blinked. "I think I swallowed chicken food." We both burst into laughter again. It felt like every failed attempt brought us closer in a way that only shared disasters can. Kenji stood up, brushing himself off, bits of corn falling from his clothes like confetti. We walked back to the tree and stared up at the structure. Miraculously, most of it was still there. A little tilted maybe, a little wobbly, but it hadn't completely come down. "That's gotta be a good sign, right?" I said. Kenji nodded. "If it can survive me, it's probably fine." We agreed not to push our luck for the rest of the day. We sat under the tree, sharing a bottle of barley tea and watching the clouds drift overhead. A dragonfly buzzed by. A cicada screamed somewhere nearby. And even though we hadn't built the whole thing yet, the tree already felt a little different, like it belonged to us now. Later that afternoon, we wrote a list of what we needed for tomorrow: stronger rope, better beams, maybe something to soften future falls, and maybe we started to think that building without nails wasn't a mistake. It was just the longer route to a better story. The next morning, we approached the tree with a quiet sort of reverence. Not because we were scared, well, maybe just a little, but because we were finally starting to understand what we were doing. Sort of. We weren't just tying wood together anymore. We were problem solving, adapting, learning mostly from failure, but still learning. Kenji had even made us official blueprints. They were drawn in crayon on the back of an old cereal box and mostly consisted of labeled arrows and questionable measurements. There was something that looked like a ladder, something that might have been a trapdoor, and a little flag with a skull that he said was for intimidation. We gathered our materials with more care this time. We cut down 2 straighter branches for beams. Kenji insisted on testing them by hitting them against the barn wall. The barn didn't love that. Neither did Grandma when she caught him doing it, though he swore he was just checking for termites. The biggest upgrade came from what we weren't technically supposed to touch: Grandpa's shed. Now, Grandpa's shed was a sacred place. It smelled like old tobacco, motor oil, and secrets. It had tools older than either of us: rusted saws, heavy hammers, and mysterious boxes full of important things we weren't allowed to ask about. The padlock on the door was new, shiny, and very off-limits. But Kenji had discovered something interesting the day before: a loose panel around the back. It was more of a crack, really, just wide enough to slip a hand through. And behind it, a small, forgotten toolbox. Dusty, a bit dented, but still holding the kind of treasure that made our eyes sparkle: pliers, a hand drill, even a coil of twine that wasn't moldy. We didn't technically break in. We didn't even take anything from the shed. We just borrowed what was next to it. That was our defense if we got caught, and Kenji made me memorize it like we were going to court. So with new tools in hand and a slightly more confident swagger, we returned to the tree. We rebuilt the base slowly, starting from scratch up in the branches. This time we used the hand drill to make tiny holes and lace the beams together with the new twine pulling tight with every knot. The tiger twist evolved into the double anchor loop, which actually held up better. We weren't sure if we'd invented a real knot or just gotten lucky, but it worked. After almost 3 hours, the base sat there, swaying gently but firmly between the branches. We sat on it carefully, inching out like we were testing ice on a lake, and it held. I swear in that moment it felt like we'd conquered the world. Or at least a tree in Grandma's backyard. Kenji threw his arms up like a champion. "We have a floor." I whooped and almost slipped off the edge, saved only by grabbing a nearby branch. We laughed loud and free, like 2 kids who just discovered gravity worked in their favor this time. We were so giddy we didn't even realize how late it had gotten. The sun had shifted west, casting long shadows across the field. Grandma rang the dinner bell from the porch, and her voice floated across the yard. Whatever you're doing, wash your hands first. We scrambled down covered in rope-burned dirt and joy. At dinner, we couldn't stop grinning. We exchanged glances every time someone mentioned productive work, proud in our secret little way. That night, Kenji whispered across our shared futon, "You think Grandpa knows?" I shrugged. "He always knows." "Think he's mad?" "Not yet." Kenji chuckled and pulled the blanket over his face. I stared at the ceiling, the faint smell of sawdust still on my hands, and felt that strange, glowing tiredness that only comes from building something with your own two hands. Even if it's lopsided, even if it's rope-bound and nail-free. The next day we started on the walls. Now we didn't have real boards, at least not enough. So Kenji had the idea to weave thin bamboo into panels. We'd seen it once in a show about jungle survival, and Kenji claimed it would be superior ventilation. We gathered what we could, thin stalks from behind the shed, some reeds from the stream, and spent the morning snapping, slicing, and weaving. It wasn't pretty. One side looked like a bird's nest during a storm, but it was ours. We fastened the panels to the sides using more twine and a few bent nails we found embedded in an old broken bench. I don't think either of us fully admitted it, but using those bent nails felt a little like cheating. Still, we reassured ourselves they didn't really count. They were basically just twisted metal pegs at that point. Kenji climbed inside our almost room, crouched in the corner, and looked around like he'd just moved into a Tokyo apartment. "Home sweet home," he said. I climbed in too, and for the first time we sat inside something we'd made, not just imagined, not just dreamed, but built. We were surrounded by crooked beams, fraying rope, and the scent of bamboo sap, and it felt like magic. We didn't talk much. We just watched the sun filter through the gaps, listened to the sound of birds rustling nearby, and let the wind rock our creation ever so gently. It creaked, yes. It groaned a little, but it held. And that was enough to call it a win. The next morning, Kenji had another wild idea. "We need a meeting," he declared, hands on hips like some self-appointed mayor. A real planning meeting. With who, I asked, still halfway through my rice porridge. "Everyone," he said, motioning broadly. "You, me, and whoever else is free." I should have known he was serious the moment he pulled out Grandma's old picnic blanket and dragged it under the tree like it was a town square. By mid-morning, the invited guests had arrived, mostly kids from the neighboring farmhouses. Junpei came first, always curious and always barefoot. Then May, who brought her little sister along, even though she insisted she wouldn't let her touch anything. Taro and Hina came too, dragging a wheelbarrow full of mystery tools that may or may not have come from their uncle's garage. And then came the chickens. Yes, chickens. It started with just one, a nosy brown hen that wandered too close to the snacks. Then another, and suddenly we were hosting the first multi-species town hall under a treehouse in progress. Kenji didn't miss a beat. He stood in front of the crowd, 6 kids and 3 hens, and tapped a ladle against an empty soup pot to call the meeting to order. "Welcome to Tree City," he said, "population US." We all cheered. Even the chickens flapped a little, which we took as a sign of approval. The agenda for the meeting was written in chalk on a flat rock. Roof options. Snacks inventory. Possible defense systems. Official anthem. Green. We voted on everything, even the anthem. Junpei nominated the jingle from the tofu delivery truck. May thought it should be the theme from her favorite cartoon. Kenji suggested we just hum dramatically whenever someone entered the treehouse, like in a movie. Somehow that won. For the roof, we had 2 proposals: palm fronds from down by the river, faraway buggy, and possibly snake-infested or patchwork tarps made from old rice sacks. We went with the tarps. They were easier, safer, and already sitting in Grandma's storage bin. As we planned, argued, and occasionally chased chickens away from our rice crackers, It began to feel less like a construction project and more like a small country. There was laughter, a few scraped knees, and at least one slightly bruised ego when May's little sister insisted she be named Tree Queen. We even made jobs. Junpei became the assistant to the builder, which mostly meant handing up tools and shouting encouragement. May handled design, decorating the ladder with string and tying little cloth flags from each corner. Taro appointed himself security, which meant standing very still near the base of the tree with a stick. The hens, though unofficial, roamed freely and clucked suspiciously at anything new. And me? I was the supply officer responsible for snacks twine and making sure Kenji didn't fall again. I took it seriously. That afternoon, we got to work again, this time as a team. The base was solid, the sides were holding, and now came the roof. We looped the tarps over the top frame and tied them to nearby branches, letting them sag slightly so rain would run off instead of pooling. May even painted one with bright red stripes using leftover dye from her grandmother's textile shed. By the time we were done, the treehouse looked, well, still very homemade. But it had charm, it had character, and more importantly, it had survived another full day of tinkering without collapsing. We all squeezed into the space legs, crisscross backs against beams, cheeks sticky with sweat and pride. Junpei passed around barley candy. Someone had brought dried sweet potato chips, and for a while the only sound was chewing and the flapping of the tarp in the breeze. Kenji looked around and grinned. "Not bad for no nails, huh?" I nodded. "It's better this way." May added, "It feels more like ours." We all agreed. That evening, we held a closing ceremony. It consisted mostly of waving sticks in the air like flags and singing our new anthem, da-da-ah-da-ah-da, as dramatically as possible. The chickens again looked unimpressed. When the others went home, Kenji and I sat under the tree again. The air was thick with the smell of grass and sun-warmed wood. Fireflies blinked slowly in the tall grass, and the sky turned soft and purple. "I think this is the best thing we've ever built," I said. Kenji leaned back and nodded slowly. "Even if it falls tomorrow." I laughed, even then. Because at that point, it wasn't just about the structure. It was the plans, the teamwork, the laughter, and that wild imagination that only kids seem to have in endless supply. We weren't building a treehouse anymore. We were building a summer. The next day began with the sound of thunder. I woke up to a sky swollen with gray clouds, the kind that looked like they'd been wrung out like a towel and still had more to give. The kind of sky that made you pause before stepping outside barefoot. Kenji stood at the window, arms crossed, staring like a general waiting for enemy troops. "Rain," he said, like it was a personal insult. We grabbed our jackets, well-oversized shirts that doubled as jackets, and ran out to the treehouse. The tarps we'd tied up the day before were flapping in the wind, and the bamboo panels creaked with every gust. When we reached the base, we stood there in silence, just listening. It was still holding, still there, but the wind made it feel like it might decide to give up at any second. "We need to reinforce the corners," Kenji muttered, mostly to himself. I nodded and we scrambled up the trunk, the bark slick under our shoes. As we climbed into the treehouse, raindrops started tapping on the tarp above, like fingers drumming on a table. At first soft, then faster, louder, heavier. Inside it was dim and warm and smelled like wet rope. The corners were dripping, but the floor stayed mostly dry. The bamboo walls shuddered with the wind, but didn't budge. We sat in the middle, legs tucked under his shoulders, brushing. "We should name it," I said suddenly as thunder rumbled in the distance. Kenji turned to me. "Name the treehouse." "Yeah, everything important has a name." He thought for a moment. "The Fort of Eternal Rope." Too dramatic. "Kenji's castle." I gave him a look. Okay, what about..." He looked around. "Camp Not a Lot." I burst out laughing. "That's so dumb." "But you smiled," he said, grinning. We sat in Camp Not a Lot as the rain poured, And for a little while, it felt like we were inside a secret world. A world built with our own hands held together by string and stubbornness. Eventually, the rain eased into a soft drizzle. The air was fresh, the grass below shimmered like polished glass, and the sky slowly cracked open to reveal slivers of light. That afternoon, Grandma came out with towels and warm tea. She didn't say much, just looked up at the tree, then at us and nodded. That was her way of saying not bad. Then Kenji had another idea. We should sleep out here. I blinked. In the treehouse. He nodded. One night, just to prove we can. I hesitated. We'd never slept outside before, not like this. And certainly not in something we built ourselves. But something about the way the tree creaked in the breeze, and the way the light filtered through the leaves above us made it seem like the best idea ever. That evening, we packed essentials, a blanket, each one flashlight, 2 onigiri, a bottle of barley tea, and a deck of cards with 3 missing. May brought over some mosquito incense and a pillow she said was specially flattened for camping. We thanked her like it was gold. As twilight faded, we climbed up one more time now, moving with muscle memory. Our little fort welcomed us with creaky floorboards and slightly damp walls, but it didn't matter. We rolled out our blankets side by side, cracked open the flashlight, and told stories in hushed voices, some real, some completely made up. We played cards until we couldn't keep our eyes open. We listened to frogs down by the river and the occasional flap of bat wings overhead. At one point, Kenji whispered, "You awake?" Barely. We should build a second level. I turned to look at him. Let's finish this one first. He grinned in the dark. Next summer. And then we fell asleep. I woke sometime after midnight. The wind was gentle. The night was still. A single beam of moonlight streamed through a gap in the tarp and lit up the little flag we'd made from an old towel. It swayed softly like it was breathing. I lay there listening to my brother's slow, steady breathing, the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, and for a moment I felt more at home than anywhere else in the world. The morning after our sleep out, the world felt different. Not in any dramatic way, there were no parades, no fireworks, but in that quiet shift only kids notice. Like waking up and realizing your favorite shirt suddenly fits a little tighter. Like hearing your voice crack for the first time and wondering if anyone else noticed. Kenji and I lay on our backs in the treehouse, staring up at the faded tarp ceiling, neither of us in any hurry to move. The air still carried that post-rain freshness, and the sky peeked through the leaves in soft patches of pale blue. It was the kind of morning where the world felt washed clean and sleepy. "You hear that?" Kenji whispered. I listened. Birds chirping, a faint breeze through the bamboo panels, the soft cluck of a chicken somewhere below. No cicadas, he said. He was right. The constant summer buzz had finally faded just like that. We both knew what it meant. Summer was nearing its end. We climbed down slowly like we were leaving something sacred behind. The grass was still damp underfoot and the dirt smelled rich and dark. Grandma was already out in the garden trimming herbs. She looked up at us with that same quiet nod of approval, said nothing, and went back to her work. After breakfast, Kenji and I sat on the porch steps, kicking our heels against the wood, sipping from mismatched cups of barley tea. Neither of us said anything for a long while. The sky was cloudless. The windmill creaked lazily in the distance. Our treehouse stood tall, leaning ever so slightly to one side as always. Then Kenji broke the silence. "We should take it down." I turned to him stunned. "Why?" "Because..." He hesitated. "School's starting soon. We won't be here much longer." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling in. He was right. Our parents were due to return by the end of the week. Then we'd pack up our clothes, help fold futons, and ride the train back to the city, where sidewalks replaced fields and trees were trimmed into perfect shapes. "But we built it," I said quietly. "We can't just leave it." Kenji shrugged. "We don't have to destroy it, just put it away." I didn't really understand what he meant until later. That afternoon, we climbed up one final time. We brought an old tin box with us, one of those biscuit tins, with a faded picture of Mount Fuji on the lid. Inside, we placed our most important things: a piece of rope from the first day, the crayon blueprint from the cereal box, one of May's tiny cloth flags, two barley candy wrappers, a feather from Kenji's feed pile crash landing, a folded slip of paper with the name Camp Not a Lot written in chicken scratch. We buried the tin in the far corner of the treehouse floor, wedged carefully between two beams tied shut with one last tiger twist for good luck. Then we stepped back and looked around. The place was still a mess, still crooked, still wildly unsafe by any adult standards. But it was ours. Every rope burn, every bent nail, every chicken that wandered in and clucked at our terrible design, those were all stitched into the wood now. We spent the rest of the day quietly reinforcing the tarps, tying extra knots, and adding a little sign made from a wood scrap that read, "Camp Not a Lot. Entry by invitation only." We left the rope ladder hanging down just slightly out of reach, like a secret waiting to be rediscovered. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and lavender, Kenji and I lay on the grass staring up at our masterpiece. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. We had built something from nothing. Not just a fort or a playhouse, but a memory. A place that belonged only to that summer, only to that version of us. I looked over at Kenji. He had his eyes closed, a slight smile on his face, hands folded behind his head like he was already dreaming. We didn't take it down. Not really, we just stopped adding to it. We let it become part of the backyard, like the windmill or the persimmon trees, something that might fall one day or grow over with vines or become home to squirrels or birds. And maybe someday someone else would find it. Or maybe it would only live on in our heads exactly as we remembered it. The morning we left the countryside, everything felt unusually still. Grandma made miso soup like always. The tatami mats were already rolled, and our backpacks stood near the door like quiet reminders that summer was over. Our parents had arrived late the night before, full of tired smiles and soft hugs, smelling faintly of hotel shampoo and train seats. We were heading back to the city, but before we packed into the van, Kenji and I exchanged a glance, and without speaking, we slipped out the back door. The grass was damp with dew, and a thin mist curled low over the fields. The air smelled like wet leaves and ash. Someone had started burning brush early. We walked past the vegetable patch, the chickens, the windmill creaking out its slow metallic song, and stopped in front of the tree. Camp Not a Lot stood quiet, half hidden by branches, a faded flag still drooping gently from the top beam. The rope ladder swayed in the breeze like it remembered us. Neither of us said anything. There wasn't anything left to say. Kenji pulled something from his pocket, one last strip of red cloth we hadn't used. He climbed the lowest branch and tied it to the side just under the main beam, a little fluttering whisper of goodbye. We stood there a while, hands in our pockets, staring like we could somehow press it all into memory. The lopsided bamboo walls, the frayed knots, the exact shade of green in the leaves above. Eventually, we turned back toward the house. At the van, Grandma handed each of us a paper-wrapped snack, for the trip roasted chestnuts, for Kenji sweet potato slices for me. She didn't say much, just patted us on the heads and gave us each a wink that somehow carried an entire conversation's worth of understanding. As we drove away, I twisted in my seat for one last look. The treehouse was almost invisible now, tucked in among the branches, just another part of the landscape. But I could still see the shape of it, still feel the rough rope in my fingers, still hear Kenji's voice echoing from the top beams. That year, autumn came quickly. Back in the city, life rushed forward like it always does. School resumed, new friends came, homework piled up. But on quiet nights, especially when the windows were open and the wind carried just the faintest hint of grass, I thought of that tree. I'd close my eyes and remember the sound of rain on tarp, the scratch of bamboo against wood, the distant cluck of a hen protesting another town meeting. Sometimes I'd dream I was back there sitting in the treehouse, knees pulled to my chest, watching the sky turn soft and golden through the leaves. And I knew even if it collapsed, even if someone else found it, or it disappeared altogether, we'd built something real. Something that belonged to a single summer, a single idea, a single moment when two brothers believed they could build a kingdom without a single nail. It must have been a few weeks after the treehouse finally stayed standing when Kenji came barreling around the corner of the barn, dragging a warped wooden door behind him like it was the greatest discovery of the century. The door scraped along the dirt path, bumping over stones and roots trailing behind him, with the kind of determination only he ever seemed to have. I was by the garden at the time, stacking kindling for Grandma's stove. Still stiff from a night spent half asleep in a bamboo-walled fort, I stood up just in time to see a cloud of feathers scatter. He'd startled the hens again. "Where'd you get that?" I asked, brushing soil from my palms. Kenji grinned, panting. "Behind the rice shed." It was just leaning there, rotten on one side but solid enough. I raised an eyebrow. "And it's our boat," he said, puffing out his chest like this revelation needed no further explanation. Of course, I should have seen it coming. Just like the treehouse, the plan had formed in his head before logic had a chance to catch up. This was classic Kenji: find something half broken, name it important, and drag me into the mission. I was already half in before I realized what was happening. "A door doesn't float," I reminded him. He tilted his head. "Neither did our first treehouse floor. You remember that?" I did. I also remembered falling into a haystack with a mouthful of feathers. But he wasn't wrong. Eventually we made it work. And so the raft was born. We hauled the door around to the side porch and laid it out flat in the dirt. It was heavier than it looked, the bottom soaked and swollen from years of rain. But the surface was broad, and to two boys with more ambition than engineering knowledge, it looked just buoyant enough. "This'll be the base," Kenji said. "We'll add stuff to the sides, buckets, crates, anything that floats." "Do we have anything that floats?" "And does bidur?" He glanced toward the barn. "Not yet." And so began our second great project of the summer. Armed with twine string and the world's loosest understanding of physics, we started gathering materials. Most of it was scavenged from the usual places: behind the compost bin, under the chicken coop, around the rusted tool shed, where we weren't exactly not allowed to go, but also weren't exactly welcome. By midday, our collection included 3 cracked plastic buckets, a splintered broom handle, a crate that once held vegetables, and a tire so dry rotted it practically crumbled when touched. Still, we declared it perfect. "Everything here either floats," Kenji announced, "or wants to." We tied things to the door with loops of itchy rope. We invented new knots, most of which involved wrapping until our fingers went numb, and then stuffing the ends into cracks so they wouldn't come loose. I wasn't sure the raft would float, but I was sure that if it sank, it would do so in one unforgettable piece. May wandered by later, chewing on a plum and watching us from a safe distance. She raised an eyebrow. "What is that supposed to be?" "Our river cruiser," I said proudly. She chewed. "Looks like a pile of trash." Kenji looked up. "It's intentional." She didn't argue, just dropped a piece of plum pit into the grass and wandered off. I didn't blame her. It didn't look like much yet. But Kenji and I saw more than rope and buckets. We saw open water, lazy drifting, maybe even a grand adventure downstream with snacks. As the sun began to set, we sat cross-legged in the dust, admiring our handiwork. The raft was lopsided, untested, and, in all likelihood, dangerous. But it was ours. Kenji tapped the wood. "We launch tomorrow." I glanced up at the sky, already turning pale orange. "You think it'll actually float?" He didn't look at me when he answered. "Only one way to find out." That night I couldn't stop thinking about the river, about the way it curved like a snake beyond the far field, quiet and brown and slow. I imagined us drifting through tall reeds, waving at frogs, chasing dragonflies, maybe even discovering something no one else had seen. Back in our shared room, Kenji lay awake too, arms crossed behind his head. "You still up?" I whispered. "Yeah." I hesitated. "What if we fall in? Then we swim. And if it sinks right away?" He rolled over with a grin I couldn't see but could hear in his voice. "Then we build it again." Morning came with a bright sky and the sound of cicadas already in full voice. Like they were cheering us on or warning us off, we couldn't tell which. Kenji was up before me, already pacing near the porch, hands on hips, inspecting the raft like it was a patient in recovery. "It dried out overnight," he announced as I stepped outside, still rubbing sleep from my eyes. "That's a good sign." I didn't mention that it also looked slightly more warped than it had the day before. The door sagged on one end, and a thin crack had opened near one of the rusted hinges. Still, it was holding together. That counted for something. We dragged it out into the open just beyond the persimmon trees to make room for additions. Kenji had brought more floaty stuff, an empty detergent bottle, 2 foam sandals with mismatched straps, and the inner tube of a wheelbarrow tire that barely had air. "We need to distribute weight evenly," he said, pointing with a bamboo stick. "1 bucket on each side. Tie the crate to the back. Sandals at the front." "The sandals? They're symbolic," he said. I didn't press further. We began tying everything down with loops of kitchen twine we'd stolen from Grandma's pantry. It wasn't ideal, but it was all we had. Each knot was a masterpiece of improvisation, twists, tucks, and triple wraps held together with sheer faith. At one point, Kenji attempted to use a bent spoon as a brace for the crate. When it didn't fit, he just hammered it flat with a brick. Around mid-morning, we took a break under the shade of the treehouse, the same one we'd built a few weeks before. We looked up at it now, like veterans, its bamboo panels and crooked tarps, seeming sturdier than ever. "This raft's going to be even better," Kenji said between bites of sweet potato chips. "We're going to travel." "Where to?" He paused. "Downstream." "How far downstream?" Kenji shrugged. "Wherever it takes us." The problem, of course, was the river. We hadn't been down there in weeks, not since the rainy spell turned it into a muddy floodplain. By now it had calmed, but we weren't sure how calm. The path to the river wound through tall grass, buzzing with insects and dotted with frogs. And the bank, last we saw it, was steep. Still, we couldn't back out now. We built paddles, or rather long sticks with slats of wood tied to one end. They looked more like mutant spoons than tools of navigation, but Kenji was confident. "I saw this in a movie," he said. "They had worse paddles and still made it out to sea." "Were they on a door?" We spent the rest of the afternoon testing weight. First, we balanced a sack of potatoes on the raft to simulate average mass, as Kenji put it. Then we sat one at a time while the other watched for wobble. The raft groaned and dipped, but didn't fall apart. "This thing's a beast," Kenji whispered reverently. We had one final decision to make: the name. I wanted something poetic. The dragonfly or moonrider. Kenji wanted the bucket beast. We settled on a compromise: the flying sea log, which made no sense at all but sounded bold when shouted. Kenji painted the name with leftover ink on the side of the door. It dripped and smeared, but by then we were already imagining the launch, the current, the freedom. May returned just before sunset. She brought a cloth pouch of dried plums and stood with us at the top of the hill, overlooking the path to the river. "Are you actually going in that tomorrow?" she asked, eyeing the raft like it might start breathing on its own. Kenji grinned. "Yep, maiden voyage. You coming?" "I'll watch," she said and handed me the pouch. "But I'm not pulling you out if it sinks." "Deal," I said. That night we set everything out, paddles leaning against the wall, a small paper bag of snacks, extra rope, and one old towel just in case. Kenji lay on his futon staring at the ceiling, eyes wide open. This is going to be the biggest thing we've ever done. Bigger than the treehouse. I think so, he said. Treehouses stay still, this one moves. Outside, the frogs began their nighttime chorus. A breeze slipped in through the window and rattled the bamboo blinds. I turned on my side eyes, drifting closed. Downstream. The thought of it tugged at my chest, not fear exactly, but something quieter. A mix of excitement and the faintest bit of wondering if we were pushing our luck again. But then again, that's what summer was for. The sun hadn't even cleared the hills when we were already rolling the raft toward the river. Kenji had tied 2 long ropes to the front like reins on a stubborn ox, and I was pushing from behind, feet slipping in the morning grass, the weight of the flying sea log heavier than we remembered. Dew clung to the underside of the door, darkening the already warped wood, and each creak it made sent a little jolt through my spine. This is it, Kenji said between breaths. The voyage begins. It hasn't even moved yet. Details. The narrow path down to the river was still shaded, lined with ferns, and the occasional spider web that I caught in the face more than once. Kenji held the ropes like he was guiding a chariot, occasionally shouting nonsense like, "Steady as she goes," or "Mind the starboard." The river came into view, suddenly calmer than I expected, but still moving a slow, steady current, weaving through cattails and flat stones. We stood at the bank for a moment, catching our breath, staring at the place where grass gave way to water. It looked wider today. "Current's not bad," Kenji muttered, mostly to reassure himself. "Do we test it first?" "With what?" I looked around and grabbed the old straw broom head we'd tied to the raft earlier. With a little effort, I pried it off, walked down the slope, and tossed it into the water. We both watched as it floated for a few seconds, then slowly turned in a circle and drifted gently downstream. "Well," Kenji said, "that counts." With a few more pushes and the kind of cooperation that only comes from siblings who argue a lot but trust each other more, we eased the raft down the slope and into the water. The door groaned. The buckets shifted. The whole thing tipped slightly to the left, then wobbled right. And then it settled. It was floating. Kenji looked at me with eyes wide as saucers. "We did it. Don't jinx it." He climbed on first, moving with the slow, careful steps of someone trying not to wake a sleeping bear. The raft dipped under his weight but didn't sink. He dropped to his knees, gave me a grin, and held out a hand. "Come aboard." I hesitated, but only for a second. The wood was cool and slick beneath my feet. As I lowered myself onto the center of the raft, the whole structure tilted slightly, then stabilized. A soft current pulled at us, just enough to feel it. Kenji handed me one of our makeshift paddles. "Captain and co-captain, ready?" "Ready." We pushed off. At first we just drifted. The river wasn't wide, but it curved gently, cradled by trees and overgrown grass. Dragonflies flitted overhead, and every so often we heard a frog splash away before we even saw it. The raft creaked with every shift of our weight, but it held. We passed a small bend where the water narrowed. Kenji dipped his paddle into the current and tried to steer. The paddle caught on something below, jerked out of his hand, and disappeared into the reeds. Seriously? It was the prototype. I handed him mine and we used it together, switching sides clumsily as we tried to avoid bumping into the bank. We didn't get far, maybe 50 meters, maybe less. But to us, it felt like a grand journey. We passed under a low-hanging willow, and I ducked just in time to avoid getting smacked by its leaves. A bird startled from a branch above us and swooped low, skimming the water just ahead of the raft. For a few minutes, everything felt silent and distant. The world we knew back by the barn seemed miles away. And then we hit the rock. Not just any rock, but one shaped like a sleeping turtle, wide and flat, hidden just below the water surface. The left side of the raft lurched upward. Buckets shifted. Kenji shouted something I didn't catch. And then there was that one moment, that long, frozen instant, when we were both trying to scramble to the middle, but already knew it was too late. The raft tipped, the rope stretched, something snapped. We were in the water before I even had time to shout. The current wasn't strong, but the shock of the cold hit like a slap. I came up sputtering, hair plastered to my forehead, blinking river out of my eyes. Kenji surfaced a moment later, arms flailing as he grabbed hold of the edge of the raft, which had now righted itself but was sinking lower by the second. The buckets came loose, he gasped. No kidding. We kicked and shoved, trying to angle the raft back toward the bank. It wasn't working. One of the foam sandals had floated off and was bobbing away proudly like it had planned an escape all along. Somewhere behind us, we heard a familiar voice. Honestly, we turned. May stood at the top of the hill, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Kenji waved. We're good. You're sinking. We were good. She sighed and walked off, probably to get Grandma again. By the time we scrambled back onto the bank, soaked and shivering, the flying sea log had given up. It floated a few meters away, half submerged with its name still barely visible under a smeared stripe of mud. Kenji collapsed in the grass beside me, coughing river water and laughing. Well, he said it floated. For a while. Yeah, he grinned, for just long enough to remember it. By the time we stumbled back to the yard, our shoes were squishing with each step, and our shirts clung to our backs like wet napkins. Kenji had twigs in his hair, one sock missing, and a faint green smear across his chin that may have been algae or possibly a bruised ego. Grandma didn't say a word. She stood there on the porch, arms folded, wooden spoon in hand, watching us like a hawk watches squirrels trying to climb a washing line. Then she turned and disappeared into the kitchen without a sound, the door swinging gently behind her. That was always worse than yelling. We peeled off the worst of the mud near the well and tried our best to clean up before being allowed indoors. May stood by the edge of the garden, arms crossed, barely containing her grin. I warned you, she said. Kenji looked up, water dripping from the tip of his nose. Correction, we almost made it. You almost made a soup, she replied, tossing him a rag. As we toweled off and squatted under the plum tree to regroup, Kenji began taking mental notes like a shipwrecked captain preparing for the sequel. Buckets need better knots, he muttered. Maybe straps instead of twine. Maybe a flat riverbed, I added. And weight distribution. You leaned too far left. I leaned, you flailed like a drowning duck. Kenji snorted, all part of the experience. We didn't argue for long. That was the thing with Kenji. He never stayed embarrassed. He just folded the moment into a future plan and moved on. He had already forgiven the flying sea log for its betrayal. Back inside, Grandma handed us each a cup of warm barley tea and a look that said, try that again and I'll use the spoon. But she didn't ask questions. She knew us too well by now. We sat on the porch floor, sipping slowly, watching the sun move lazily across the roof tiles. It was the kind of quiet you only get in the middle of nowhere, cicadas buzzing in the trees, a crow calling once in the distance, the rhythmic flap of drying laundry. Then Kenji said, we need a better name. I blinked. It just sank. Exactly. Flying sea log sounds like something that crashes. We need a name that floats. I was still processing that logic when he reached for the notebook we kept tucked behind the plant pots, our project log. It had plans for the treehouse, sketches of a chicken feeder we never built, and one very detailed diagram for a pulley system involving a bucket and several eggs. Kenji flipped to a fresh page and wrote across the top, Raft 2.0, float or nothing. He drew a rectangle that was meant to represent the base and began labeling parts with things we didn't yet own. Plastic drums, plywood, pool noodle stabilizers. I leaned in. Where are we going to find pool noodles? Kenji tapped the page with his pencil. We don't find them. We build something better. Outside, the clouds had started to gather again. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves. It smelled like distant rain and dry grass. I looked out at the fields, then toward the river. Somewhere down there, a few fragments of our failed raft were probably still drifting, wedged between rocks or caught in a bend. Part of me felt a twinge of disappointment. We hadn't gone far. We hadn't even made it past the second curve. But another part of me, the part that had seen the raft float, even just for a few minutes, felt something else entirely. Pride, maybe, or the strange, quiet joy that comes from doing something completely ridiculous and loving every second of it. After dinner that evening, we went out one more time to where the remains of the flying sea log had been hauled ashore. It was damp, stained, and missing at least one bucket, but Kenji crouched beside it like it was an artifact. Next time, he said, we balance the sides. We had a real paddle, and maybe some kind of canopy. For shade, I asked. For style, he said. We gathered the salvageable parched rope bottles, one still good foam sandal, and brought them back behind the barn. May helped us sort them into piles, and before we knew it, we were sketching again. This time, Kenji suggested pontoons. I wasn't sure what pontoons were exactly, but he said it with such confidence that I just nodded. Sounds good. We worked until the fireflies came out, until our fingers were smudged with charcoal and dusk had wrapped around the edges of the field. By the time we washed up and crawled under our blankets, the rain had begun to patter gently against the roof. Kenji lay with one arm flung over his forehead, staring into the dark. You think it'll work next time? I think I said it's already better. He smiled, barely visible in the dim room. That's all we need, right? Yeah, I whispered, letting the sound of rain lull me toward sleep. That's all we need. We spent the next 3 days doing what we called serious research, which mostly meant sneaking into Grandpa's shed and staring at the strange things hanging on the wall until we got ideas. Grandpa wasn't around. He'd gone to the neighboring village for a funeral, so we took full advantage of the quiet. Kenji stood in front of a stack of old barrels, arms crossed like he was trying to read their thoughts. These could work, he said. They're full of soy paste. So they're heavy and they smell like miso. He gave a thoughtful nod. Miso floats right. I didn't have the science to argue with that, but I still had doubts. We needed something light, something that wouldn't sink the moment we sat down. Eventually, we found 2 empty chemical drums near the compost heap. They were faded yellow and smelled like engine oil, but they made a hollow thunk when we knocked on them, promising. With a lot of groaning, sliding, and strategic rolling, we managed to get them behind the barn. Kenji beamed at them like they were golden treasure. Perfect. These are the pontoons. You still don't know what pontoons are, do you? Not exactly, but they're round and floaty. That's all that matters. We used the busted door again, as the base reinforced now, with an extra layer of wooden slats from an old crate. With the drums tied underneath using heavier rope, the whole thing sat higher off the ground. Kenji even managed to convince May to donate an old cushion from her porch bench for comfort in class. This time we took things slowly. No rushing, no random sandals for decoration. We drilled tiny holes, real holes with Grandpa's hand drill, and secured every corner with as many loops of rope as our arms could manage. Kenji named every knot we used: the crooked clam triple windmill, and my favorite, the panic stopper. By the second evening, the new raft sat proudly in the barnyard. Taller, tighter, somehow more boat-like, though it still looked like something a junkyard would reject. We painted a new name along the side, the unsinkable walnut, after a long debate. It's small, Kenji explained, but tough, like a walnut. And it's brown, I added. Exactly. The launch was set for early morning before the sun got too hot. We checked the weather. May gave us one of her father's old straw hats for the captain, and Taro from the house across the field offered to bring a bucket of cucumbers as emergency snacks. We were building momentum. Our second voyage had turned into a neighborhood event. At dawn, we gathered everything: paddles, rope, a bento box filled with rice balls, and a towel that smelled faintly of soy sauce. The raft was rolled downhill with much ceremony. Kenji even hummed something that sounded like an anthem. The riverbank was misty again, soft light spilling through the trees. The current was calm, almost too perfect, like it was waiting for us. We eased the unsinkable walnut into the water. This time it floated immediately, higher than the flying sea log, sturdier. The drums beneath held their shape, and the base barely even creaked. Kenji climbed aboard, first crouching low and balancing like a cat, then me. No tipping, no wobbles. May clapped from the shore. Taro tossed us each a cucumber like we were off to war. Kenji gave the paddle a ceremonial dip. Let's go. And we did. We drifted slowly at first, the raft gliding smoother than we expected. The water parted beneath us, frogs hopped from stones, and even the birds seemed to cheer us on with their morning chirps. For once, everything worked. We rounded the first bend, success. We passed the willow from last time, still success. Then we entered the part of the river we hadn't reached before. It opened slightly wider, bordered by tall reeds and shadows that stretched long across the surface. Kenji stood up. Don't, I said. I'm just looking. Kenji. Too late. He waved his arm dramatically like he was saluting some invisible crew. And that's when it happened. Not a rock this time, but a submerged tree limb just under the water. We hit it at an angle. The raft jolted. One drum shifted slightly, pulling hard on its rope. We didn't capsize, but we did rotate, slowly, majestically, like a very confused merry-go-round. Kenji shouted, paddle right, paddle right. I did, but the raft just spun faster. May, still visible in the distance, was bent over laughing. Eventually we drifted into a patch of reeds, and the raft lodged itself gently like a loaf of bread in a basket. There we sat, tilted, slightly, completely stuck, but dry. I think Kenji said, catching his breath, we need a rudder. I think I said we need a rope next time, so someone can pull us back. Despite the awkward ending, neither of us felt defeated. The raft had floated, it had turned. It had even gone farther than before. We had built something from trash and twine and turned it into a vessel, even if it ended up pointed the wrong way. After a bit of wiggling and some creative paddling, we freed ourselves and drifted gently back toward the launch point, tired but triumphant. As we stepped off the raft, I looked back at it bobbing in the water. The unsinkable walnut, smudged paint, crooked knots and all. Kenji wrapped his towel around his shoulders like a cape. Same time tomorrow. I grinned, definitely. The next day it rained. Not the light, misty kind of rain we usually got in late summer. This was the heavy, thundering kind that turned dirt paths into little rivers and flattened the tall grass around the barn. We watched from the porch, chewing sweet potato chips and staring out at the blurred silhouette of our beloved raft, now resting upside down under the persimmon trees, its bright yellow drums catching raindrops like drums at a concert. Kenji let out a long sigh and leaned his head against one of the wooden porch pillars. We were gonna make improvements today. You can't improve a boat in a thunderstorm. He crossed his arms. We could have designed a rudder. We don't even know what a rudder looks like. Kenji pointed at the paddles. Just a skinnier paddle stuck to the back. That's probably not wrong. We sat there in silence for a while, the kind that only exists when plans are canceled by nature. May came by with a plastic sheet over her head, holding a small bowl of pickled cucumbers, and a look that clearly said, "You're lucky you didn't sink again." "I brought you weather snacks," she said, handing the bowl to Kenji, "so you can mope more effectively." "Thanks," he muttered, taking one with theatrical sadness. "I still think the raft is cursed," she added, glancing out toward the yellow barrels in the distance. Kenji sat up straighter. "It's not cursed, it's just sensitive to weather patterns." I bit into a cucumber and mumbled, sensitive like a chicken that doesn't want to lay eggs. The rain went on for most of the afternoon. With outdoor plans postponed, we gathered on the porch laying out every piece of rope cloth and plastic we still had left. Kenji, determined to make use of the day, began sketching what he called the future of personal water travel. It included a central seat with cup holders, an emergency snack locker, foldable wings for gliding mode, and a series of small flags for international diplomacy. May blinked. Are you building a raft or a parade float? A hybrid, Kenji said proudly. Even Taro came by, dragging a muddy bucket filled with river stones he insisted might be important for balance. Despite the storm, the day passed in a strange, gentle rhythm. We worked together under the roof, protected by the soft patter of rain, the porch creaking beneath us as we tied knots, unfolded plans, and tried to imagine what else the river might offer if we just kept trying. By late afternoon, the rain had softened to a drizzle. The smell of wet earth hung heavy in the air, and the breeze carried the occasional drop that rolled off the leaves above. Kenji stood at the porch edge, holding one of our paddles like a cane, gazing dramatically at the cloudy sky. Tomorrow, he said, we set sail again. May raised an eyebrow. You sure everything's soaked? That's what towels are for. I reached down and patted the old towel resting beside the door. It was still damp from yesterday's voyage now, heavier, colder, and probably never going to dry completely. But I smiled anyway. You are thinking of a new name, I asked. Kenji tilted his head. No, the unsinkable walnut is still afloat. Technically, I said, it's upside down, resting like a walrus. We stayed up a little later that night, lanterns glowing faintly inside the house while the wind tickled the shoji screens. Kenji was already halfway through his next drawing. This one included a roof made of old umbrellas, and I was carefully threading more rope through the side slats of a crate that might serve as our new storage bin. The river might have been too wild for sailing that day, but it hadn't stopped us from moving forward. At some point, Grandma peeked in, took one look at the paper scraps, rope coils, and cucumber stems scattered across the tatami, and simply said, "Don't forget to sweep up when you're done." That was her way of saying you're making a mess, and also you're building something bigger than it looks. As we lay down that night, the sound of rain still whispering across the roof, Kenji turned over and said, "You know, I think we could go past the bend next time." I didn't even open my eyes. You said that last time. This time I mean it. Still going to wear the straw hat. Obviously. The raft, the river, the quiet thrill of trying something ridiculous and a little dangerous. None of it was perfect, but somehow that made it better. And deep down, I knew we weren't just floating on water. We were floating on the kind of summer you only get once and never really leave behind. The storm passed overnight, leaving behind that heavy silence that only comes after a good long rain. The ground was soft beneath our feet, and the air smelled like wet bark, mud, and something almost electric, like the whole yard had been scrubbed clean. Kenji was already outside when I woke up, crouched next to the unsinkable walnut, which had survived the rain with only one of its barrels slightly tilted and the cushion a little soggier than usual. He looked up with a grin. "She's still good." "You mean damp." He stood and brushed his hands off on his shorts. "That just means she's been seasoned." We spent the early morning tightening ropes, replacing the cushion with a dry cloth mat, and fixing one of the paddles that had splintered. Kenji, with great ceremony, installed a small string of cloth flags across the back beam, cut from scraps of old shirts and tied together with fishing line. They fluttered slightly in the breeze, giving the raft a strange but charming dignity. May arrived with a paper bag of dried seaweed and a look that said, "I still think this is a bad idea." But she handed over the snacks anyway. "I also brought this," she said, pulling out a small handheld fan. "Not for the raft, for me, while I watch." "Appreciated," Kenji said, nodding solemnly. The river had calmed again, its surface smooth and glassy, with just enough movement to remind us it was still alive. The sun hung lower in the sky than the first time we launched, and shadows stretched longer across the banks. This time we had a plan. Kenji had sketched out the route, and we'd made small anchor ropes, really just bits of twine tied to rocks, but they made us feel prepared. We'd even brought one of Grandpa's old soup pots as a makeshift bailer, just in case things got splashy. With a few steady heaves and a lot of careful maneuvering, the unsinkable walnut was back in the water. This time it floated higher than ever, the barrels snug against the bottom, the crate tied more securely than before. Kenji stepped aboard first, giving his paddle a little twirl. "Permission to board." "Granted," I said, handing over the rice balls wrapped in wax paper. I climbed on next. May watched from the bank, fanning herself slowly like a disinterested queen. The river welcomed us. We glided past the first bend easily, and Kenji steered us away from the spot where the flying sea log had met its end. A dragonfly hovered nearby, keeping pace with us for several meters, before veering off toward the trees. "Let's go farther," Kenji said. I nodded. We passed familiar sights. The willow, the rocks we'd once mistaken for river monsters, even the patch of reeds where we got stuck during our first trip. But then the world began to shift. The river widened. Trees leaned in from both sides, casting shade across the water. It felt cooler here, quieter. We didn't say much. We just paddled gently, drifting sometimes, letting the current carry us. I lay back for a while, eyes half closed, listening to the splash of water against barrels and the soft squeak of rope tightening around wood. Somewhere deeper into this stretch of the river, we saw a turtle sunbathing on a rock. It didn't flinch as we passed. Kenji saluted it with his paddle. "We're in uncharted territory now," he whispered, as if the turtle were the last marker on a map. The river curved again, sharper this time. Kenji leaned forward, trying to guide us with one paddle. The raft tilted slightly but adjusted. We rounded the bend, and there it was. A small clearing along the opposite bank where the trees opened up and sunlight spilled like a quiet invitation. The grass there was tall and golden, swaying in the breeze, and a single log stretched partway into the river like a dock. It was beautiful, undisturbed, wild, and somehow waiting for us. We paddled toward it slowly. The raft brushed gently against the shore. Kenji jumped off first, landing with a soft whoomph in the grass. I followed, dragging the rope onto dry ground. We stood there for a moment, silent, looking at our raft. Our ridiculous, patched-together, glorious raft. It had made it. We had made it. Kenji raised both arms in victory. "I hereby declare this land Walnut Bay." I laughed. "That doesn't even make sense." "Don't care," he said. "It's our spot now." We stayed there most of the afternoon, lying in the grass, eating the seaweed May had given us, and staring up at the drifting clouds. Every so often, we glance at the unsinkable walnut, still bobbing patiently against the shore, and feel something settle in our chests, something warm and weightless. Eventually, we knew we had to head back. The shadows grew longer, and the sun dipped lower behind the trees. We pushed off again, retracing our route, the current now slower and the raft steady beneath our feet. By the time we reached the bank near home, May was gone, but she left behind a stick in the sand with a flag tied to it, a scrap of red cloth we recognized from Kenji's old summer shirt. "That's her way of saying well done," I said. Kenji picked it up and smiled. We pulled the raft ashore, flipped it gently, and leaned it beside the shed. No words needed. We both knew today had been more than just a raft ride. It had been a real journey, one we'd remember long after the rope frayed and the wood splintered. The morning after our longest voyage, the world felt a little quieter, like even the wind had taken a breath. We didn't have any big plans that day, not because we were tired, though we were, but because something about the trip to Walnut Bay made everything else feel like enough. Kenji was already awake when I stepped outside. He was sitting on the porch steps, barefoot, staring out toward the tree line, with a rice cracker in one hand and his notebook in the other. You drawing something? He nodded without looking up. A map of the river. I sat beside him and leaned over to see the page. He'd labeled the parts we'd passed: the Willowgate Turtle Rock, the Crooked Turn, and in all capital letters, Walnut Bay. You forgot Chicken Bend, I said, pointing to a spot near the reeds where we'd once been chased by a hen that wandered too far. That's upstream. Different voyage. We stayed there a while, the morning sun rising slow and gold behind the barn. Grandma's wind chimes clinked softly in the breeze, and somewhere out back, one of the hens made her usual dramatic announcement that she'd laid another egg. Eventually, Kenji closed the notebook and said we should build a dock. I turned to him, expecting the usual grin, the spark of another impossible idea. But his expression was softer this time, almost thoughtful. Not today, he added quickly. Just someday. That was how I knew summer was ending. We didn't talk about it out loud, but we both felt it. The air was different now, less sticky, more crisp. The cicadas didn't scream quite as loudly. And when the breeze came, it carried the scent of dry leaves and pine needles, not just grass and sun. Later that afternoon, we wandered down to the riverbank one more time, not with a raft or a paddle, but just ourselves. The water moved slower now, as if it too were growing sleepy. We sat by the edge, toes just touching the cool surface, watching ripples form and disappear. Kenji skipped a few stones badly, and I tried balancing one on the top of my knee without letting it fall. That was the kind of quiet challenge we gave ourselves when there was nothing left to fix or build. Do you think the raft will last till next year? I asked. Kenji shrugged. If it doesn't, we'll build another. I nodded. Better one. Bigger one, he added. Maybe with 2 levels. And an engine. And a snack drawer. We laughed. Not because it was ridiculous, though it was, but because we believed it. In that moment, we could still imagine next summer stretching out in front of us like a road. We hadn't yet reached the age where time slips away quietly. We were still living in the middle of everything. That night after dinner, we dragged the unsinkable walnut back into the barn. Not because it was broken, it wasn't, but because we didn't want it to sit out and rot. We laid it gently across 2 hay bales, patted the drums, and tied a soft cloth over the top to keep the dust off. I think it earned a rest, Kenji said. I agreed. Before heading inside, I slipped something into the little crate tied to the side. Our old painted sign, Camp Not a Lot. It was faded now, the letters barely visible, but it felt right, like closing a circle. That night, we didn't talk much before falling asleep. The lantern flickered low beside our futons, and the crickets outside sang their late summer song, slow and steady. But just before I drifted off, I heard Kenji mumble, "Next summer." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because the story wasn't over, it was just waiting. Word count 1, owner 93. Relaxing conclusion, 300 words. The seasons changed slowly that year. One morning, the wind just carried a little more chill, and the shadows stretched a little longer across the garden. Our days were filled with fewer wild plans and more quiet chores, gathering persimmons, sweeping the porch, helping Grandma pickle vegetables in big ceramic jars. But every time I passed the barn, I glanced at the place where we stored the raft, and I smiled, because I knew it was still there, waiting. The wood might grow brittle, the ropes might fray, and the drums might eventually lose their color. But the feeling, that perfect mix of courage and nonsense, of determination and laughter that would stay. Even now, sometimes I think about those days when the world felt bigger than it was, when the river wasn't just a stretch of water, but a place that led to adventure. When building something with your own hands, no matter how crooked, made you feel taller somehow. And in quiet moments, maybe while washing dishes or walking home in the late afternoon, I can still hear the creak of the raft underfoot, the splash of paddles, and Kenji's voice shouting nonsense to the sky as we drifted into the unknown. And I hope you remember your own versions of those days too. Soft, silly, and soaked with sunlight. End of script. Sweet dreams.